In my first couple of months, people were kind of impressed with my level. Oh, he'd only learnt it from books. Oh, he's only been in Spain for a couple of months. Much like Shakira's hips, when it comes to language learning, the numbers don't lie. In this video, we're going to talk about the importance of not wasting your precious language learning time when you move to a country of your target language. As I've mentioned in my previous videos, I moved to Barcelona to learn Spanish. I lived there for 2 years, and here I'm going to tell you about a realization I had that might help you with your language learning, as well as the choices you make when you move to a country to learn a new language. In my first few weeks, I was pretty excited to be in Barcelona. It seemed like a city that was really in the thick of things. There were people from all over Europe either visiting or living there. I was surrounded by Spanish as well as many other languages. It seemed like a very vibrant city to be in. Despite the usual immediate concerns of finding a job and somewhere to stay, it was offset by the exhilaration of being in a new place. I was speaking more Spanish than ever, and it wasn't in artificial settings or with lone native speakers, all of which I had to organize by myself. There were Spanish speakers everywhere. But to be honest, as honeymoon periods go, mine in Barcelona was pretty short, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The conditions of my English teaching job were worse than anything I had experienced as an adult. There was no job security, students could cancel at any moment, and even if they gave me 24 hours notice, it wasn't that easy to fill their time slot. So I had money concerns from the outset. I watched my savings dwindle and dwindle. It was also much harder to register as a resident of the municipality because of the precarious nature of my work contract. My inhalers for my asthma were costing €75 each until I could sort out my health insurance. I had some stress finding the right place to live. It wasn't that easy to find an apartment that was reasonably priced and where you weren't being treated like a tenant by your own housemates, like a live-in student, perhaps living with an older person in some sort of like B&B type situation, or like some sort of student halls type situation, or some combination of all of the above. It wasn't like what I was used to in Melbourne, where you would live in a share house with people who had common values and you might even become friends while living together. In Barcelona, it just felt like everybody was trying to make a quick buck off you. So why is all this relevant to me learning Spanish in Barcelona? Well, I lived in 3 apartments in the space of about 3 or 4 months, my first 3 or 4 months. In the first 2 places, I was living with all Spanish speakers, but circumstance dictated that I moved into a 3rd place where it started out as 50-50 Spanish and English speakers. But over the course of time, again with life happening, I ended up living with 1 Spanish speaker and 3 other English speakers, well, including myself. Trust me, you can move to a country with the best of intentions of learning the language by living with all speakers of that language, but sometimes life dictates. The search in my first 3 months in Barcelona to find an affordable and comfortable place where I was at home with my housemates had taken a toll. I was too burnt out from being ripped off and people going back on their word to, after discovering that I was living with only 1 Spanish speaker, move to a 4th place just in the name of living with only Spanish speakers. With the fact that Catalan people prefer not to speak Spanish, internationals tend to use English as their lingua franca, and the fact that Catalan is more visible on signposts, government documents, and in supermarkets, and that you can end up living with people who are not Spanish speakers, all of this leads to you losing a lot of practice time, a lot of osmosis when it comes to learning Spanish. With all of these things chipping away at your Spanish speaking time, you're losing some serious ground. The same you with the same language capabilities put in a different context would be learning far more. If you'd orchestrated things in such a way that you only lived with Spanish speakers in Barcelona, or if you moved to another part of the country where there were not as many of these inevitable booby traps in terms of your Spanish speaking in Barcelona, or if you'd moved to almost anywhere in South America except Brazil, then you'd probably be better off. I started to notice this myself as time wore on in Barcelona. In my first couple of months, people were kind of impressed with my level. Oh, he'd only learnt it from books. Oh, he's only been in Spain for a couple of months. When time gets on, you've been there for 2 years, you're in a circle of people comparing notes on their own Spanish learning journey, and people perceive your level. They go, oh, 2 years. And they don't have a compliment to give you. And in this conversation that I remember, there was a guy who'd been living in Colombia. Admittedly, he'd also had a Colombian girlfriend, which would have helped. But his Spanish was at a different level. His fluency, his accent, his vocabulary, it was just a no-brainer. Whereas I felt a little bit like the cogs were still turning. I would get to potholes in my Spanish and just couldn't come up with the word. And it's just noticeable after 2 years. But as well as my living situation, I was also an English teacher. So I wasn't really speaking Spanish in my job. I've mentioned this in other videos. This will happen to a lot of native speakers of English and even other languages. You just have to find a job in your language at least to start with. Sometimes I would speak Spanish to my students when they needed a bit of a break from English, but it's not a great idea when you're an English teacher. So I would teach English all day and then I would get back to my apartment and I was living with a Northern Irish guy, an American girl, and a Peruvian guy. On top of all of this, my interest in playing live music took me to open mics. Little did I know that this would also be full of either internationals or English speakers, or at least the ones that I went to. So within about 3 to 4 months of moving to Barcelona, my work, leisure and home life were all essentially through English. So you can imagine what this did to my Spanish speaking time. One saving grace was my housemate Diego. He was from Peru and we became friends, housemates and bandmates, and we met at one of the open mics that I mentioned earlier. We struck up a friendship in my first couple of months in Barcelona, which were also his first couple of months. This led to him moving into my apartment. Between being in each other's bands and living together, we spent a fair amount of time together. Just from hanging out, I specifically remember learning a lot of the he said, she said stuff. I'm not talking about gossip, I'm just talking about basic conjugations that are necessary in order to have a conversation in another language. I said to him that she was going to do this, and then he said that she said. That stuff is quite difficult, and your brain needs the chance to get itself around all of that stuff. It's the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of the language. It was on a trip I had with Diego that I had this realization of how important it is to get multi-hours of this type of practice in every week, if not every day. It seems so obvious, but it took me going on a trip to Toulouse, France in order to figure this out. After about 6 months of living in Barcelona, Diego and I went on a trip to Toulouse. During that trip, I was quite charmed by Toulouse. To be honest, I quite enjoyed the smaller city vibe. Despite the fact I didn't speak much French, I got a good impression of the place and the people. It seemed unblemished by the type of hypertourism you find in Barcelona, so the locals didn't seem to suffer by the accompanying aversion to tourists or foreigners in general. Diego and I hung out with this Mexican-American guy. We spoke Spanish the whole time. We were speaking Spanish for hours a day in Toulouse. I had to come to France to speak the amount of Spanish that I wanted to. Ironically, in my day-to-day life in Barcelona, a far more Spanish-speaking city than Toulouse, I just couldn't get this type of practice in. Perhaps I haven't fully mentioned the epiphany I had, but it was essentially this. If you're only speaking for 1 hour a day in Spanish for 2 years, how is that going to compare to somebody who's doing it 2, 3, 4 hours a day for the same period of time? Ultimately, some people might achieve that by getting more of it at work, getting more of it through their friends or their housemates, and I wasn't getting that, and that's the epiphany I had. In spite of the best of intentions, I just wasn't getting the practice I wanted, even though I thought I was where I needed to be. This is something I couldn't have even imagined before I moved there, but as I keep saying, life takes over, and learning a language when you move to a new city is not the only thing that you need to do. The reality is there's no replacement for that degree of hours-long day-to-day practice. Professionals can move to big cities like Barcelona or Madrid and be reasonably well paid, but they will likely do so in English-speaking firms or in languages that they can speak. As your Spanish improves, you may be more likely to find jobs where Spanish is the lingua franca, but also the fact that you come from another country and speak another language so well, that could be your niche and it could stay that way. If you want to balance your desire to learn the language that you've moved there for with other life things, you just have to make peace with the fact that it could take longer than expected. I only stayed for 2 years, but I'm sure that if I'd stayed longer, I eventually would have got to the place that I wanted to. I am conscious of the fact that people who perhaps took lower paying jobs or less secure jobs, such as in bars or in restaurants, might have learned Spanish a lot faster and in a funny way have integrated much better, much sooner. If learning the local language isn't your top priority, it's very possible that other life priorities will corner you into a lifestyle where you won't be learning anywhere near as much of the language as you had hoped. This would all be fine, except some of you might be going there for a couple of weeks, 3 months, 6 months. It really depends. I think the shorter the time you are there, the more you should probably try to prioritize all of your different life elements that I've mentioned being purely in the language you're trying to learn and with people who are native speakers. These are just some of my experiences and my little epiphany. It might be different for you. You can either try to avoid some of these pitfalls so that you get a bit more of that osmosis experience, or simply make peace with the fact that you're trying to learn a language and also juggle it with the rest of your life. Thanks a lot for watching. I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments below. Here are a couple of my videos if you're interested. See you next week.